And welcome everybody. I am really thrilled to introduce today's webinar on energy futures, Anthropocene challenges, emerging technologies, and everyday life. I'm Miriam Axel. I'm a postdoc here at the California Institute for Energy and Environment at UC Berkeley, and also on the BECC conference organizing committee. And I'm really excited to share that the call for abstracts for BECC 2023 in Sacramento is now open. So make sure you submit your abstracts. The deadline is April 1st, and you can submit directly on the BECC conference website. Just a reminder that this year, the virtual component of BECC is our monthly webinars, which continue to be free to attend. And next month we'll be announcing shortly. And then of course, the in-person component is in Sacramento in November. A huge thank you to all of our sponsors. This wouldn't be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. And if you're interested in sponsoring one of these webinars or the BECC conference, feel free to reach out to info@beccconference.com. So just here are a couple of, tips for the webinar. Please remain muted. The webcam is optional but encouraged, and please use the chat for questions. We encourage your questions and discussion throughout the webinar, and we'll have plenty of time for your questions at the end of the presentation. And in the meantime, just to get a sense of who we have here today, I'd love to hear your name, what you're working on, maybe what you're excited about, or what you hope to learn from this webinar. And feel free to put that in the chat. And then as far as clarifying questions, we'll take those between the presentations, and then we'll save the longer discussion questions for the end. And now I'm really thrilled to introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Susan Mazur-Stommen, cultural anthropologist and founder and principal at Indica Consulting, and she'll be our moderator for today. And Dr. Simone Abram is professor in anthropology at Durham University and the co-director of the Durham Energy Institute. Dr. Nathalie Hortard, she's a senior researcher in anthropology at the ENTPE University of Lyon in France. And Dr. Karen Waltorp is associate professor and filmmaker and the head of the ethnographic exploratory at the Department of Anthropology at University of Copenhagen. So give a warm welcome to our speakers, and thank you all so much for joining us. And I'll pass it off to you, Susan.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Miriam. And by the way, it is Mazur-Stommen. I always joke it's Mazur like manure and not Mazur like razor. And it's indicia, not indica, but just making sure. So let me give you guys a little bit of context. I'm really honored to have been asked to be the moderator for this exciting panel. And some of the context I just wanted to give you was the context of energy and anthropology over the last 10 or 20 years. Basically in 2000, we had a wonderful paper that was written called The Legacy of 20 Years of Energy Demand Management. We know more about individual behavior, but next to nothing about demand. And that was the recently passed Harold Wilhite, Elizabeth Shove, Lauren Lutzenheiser, and Willett Kempton. And in it, they really called for bringing anthropologists into understanding the consumption of energy. In 2007, the conference BECC was founded, and similarly was really aiming to understand both individual and organizational behavior and decision-making related to energy usage, greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, and sustainability. In 2012, we have the book Cultures of Energy, Power, Practices, and Technologies, edited by Sarah Strauss, Stephanie Rupp, and Thomas Love. And here we are today, approximately 10 years later, with a new and exciting book called Energy Futures, The Anthropocene Challenges, Emerging Technologies, and Everyday Life. And our speakers today are going to be talking about the ways in which anthropology and the ethnographic method and practices can really enhance our understanding about these challenges. We will be talking about not just methodologies, but also different perspectives, including looking at how to decolonialize some of our assumptions and practices. So with that note, I'm going to mostly be just helping out here, facilitating a little bit. As Miriam mentioned, we will be having our speakers talk on slightly different topics. And in between, I will turn to chat and look for a clarifying question. and ask that. And then we will move on, and then we will have 10 or 15 minutes to ask some questions at the end. And I will also be asking probably some questions of our panelists at the end. So with that said, I believe our first speaker is Simone. Am I correct?
Simone, yes, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the introduction. It's always fascinating when you talk to a different audience and you hear a different trajectory. Of course, we're very familiar with the work of Reliant and Chauvin and so forth. We come from a slightly different direction to this, from an increasing interest in anthropologies of energy from a more European background. But this book that we want to talk about today is very much an international effort. And it comes out of a kind of interesting event, which we put together way back in before the pandemic, if you can remember that far back, when we actually met in person in Lyon, hosted by my colleague here, Nathalie. And we brought together two networks of anthropology that come out of the European Anthropological Association. One focused on futures and the other on energy. And several of us overlapped those interests, and we realized it was time to put them together. And we brought together a fairly large group of scholars from across Europe and also from Australia, including our colleague Sarah Pink, who you may be familiar with, who is now based in Australia, and unfortunately for that reason couldn't join us this evening. And we asked people to think about what was going on when we talk about energy futures. What actually are we talking about when we talk about the future in relation to energy? And very much inspired by a reaction, I guess, to the assumption that energy futures are exclusively defined by technologists and economic forecasters. So we could go to the next slide, I think, here. Thank you. So we wanted to think also in new ways about what anthropology can bring to the study of the future, which has taken a number of different approaches, really. The one that we're interested in is one that's very engaged, that doesn't stop with a question about how do we study the way that people think about the future, but says, how can we actually engage in that and bring that knowledge into design work around energy futures and bring our concerns about the social, political, and other impacts of changing energy systems and energy infrastructures, energy markets, and so forth, to bear on the way that the energy, the future of energy is imagined in different contexts. And in our little blurb about this talk, we mention the idea of an energy imaginary. And I know that might be an unfamiliar term to people. The reason we use it is to say that the way that people imagine the future is not each person using their own personal imagination and thinking what the future might be, but there are, I guess, tropes or narratives that circulate about the future. In some ways, very concrete ones, the kind that the International Energy Association might put forward with various kind of trends and graphs and so forth. And other much more personal or intimate concerns about, how to manage your household, how to make a living if you cannot afford to access electricity, for example, or fuel. And that there are imaginaries, there are kind of fixed imaginaries that move around, that develop, that circulate, that have a real impact on what happens in the future, because that's the basis for decisions about what happens next. So our aim then is to bring together various theories and methods from futures anthropology, bring those critical perspectives from energy anthropology, which I have to say are not simply about energy demand and energy consumption, but very much more broadly about anyone involved in relation to energy, I guess, infrastructures, but also, broadly energy systems, and to bring them together to disrupt some of those dominant narratives about energy futures and see where that takes us. So we go to the next slide. Thank you. So what we've got in this book is something a little bit unusual, which is that at that event in Lyon, we realized that we were more than a collection of different case studies. We were more than a collection of different arguments. We had a huge amount in common. We were arguing about very similar things. So we realized the challenge for us was not to edit together a collection, but to write a book together. And that's what we've done with this book. We've taken 4 sort of general headings and grouped ourselves into those chapters using the case studies from each of the scholars or the groups of scholars that came forward to the seminar. So we have a general introduction about the importance of imagining energy futures, which obviously builds on some of the science and technology studies work around energy imaginaries and so forth, scientific imaginaries. Then we focused first on the everyday futures and spaces and mobilities. So that's taking a kind of classical anthropological fieldwork interest in how the everyday is tied up and tied into broader contexts and broader conditions. And the examples are there around smart charging, around co-working space, around expectations of energy demand, and kind of reflections on the way that ownership is so central in kind of corporate and technological imaginaries of energy. Then we looked about contested futures, we say, of and with energy generation, which is to say that we are also looking at the people who manage energy systems. And also those who engage in, I guess, democratic challenges and social challenges to the futures that are envisaged. So that includes a case study which is very relevant at the moment because it's just come to a head in Germany around protests against the undermining of villages in coal mining areas. We look at contested imaginaries of wind futures in Taiwan. We look at the sort of contested prospects for solar energy, and that's particularly in relation to the Barefoot College approach to women's engineering activities. And also a case study on modelling, on engineers and the way that they model energy futures. We should have another slide there on the next 2 chapters. Thank you. The fourth chapter is around digitalization, which Karen is going to talk to us about in a minute, which thinks about the role of data centers and the role of digitalization in the idea of smart futures in these different contexts. And then finally, a chapter that really thinks about decolonization, the way in which colonialism is built into many of the visions of existing and new forms of energy circulation. And we have another 4 examples of there. One from the Norwegian Arctic, one around the Chilean Andes, including the kind of look back at the previous future imaginaries and their legacies, one about fracking, and one about this kind of close and complicated relationship between data and care. So as I say, the kind of basis for this is around these dominant narratives, and we start with something of a critique of energy scenarios. I probably don't have much time to go into that now, so maybe it's better if I hand over to my colleagues to talk about. We can tell you a bit about each of the different chapters and the different approaches that we've made. How would that be? Okay, Karen, I'm handing over to you, I think, now. Or is it to Natalie? Sorry.
No, it's me, but I couldn't find my unmute button. And so we started the book, and it was also a wish to start from the everyday, future, and space and mobilities. So how does the everyday interact with energy and with the question of the future, and what does it mean also to question the mundane? One of the specificity also of the book is really to try to see how we can address the question of methodology, how ethnography can inform the future, and energy discussion can step into the discussion of energy and the future. So here, for example, we have used Sarah Pink has used the comic strips used by the energy provider in order to try to enhance people to change their behavior and their energy consumption. And there is also this use of by Elizabeth Rush and Michael Koene of the other types of discussions, and by interviewing tenants together. So in this chapter, we discuss example across Australia and Europe concerning the tensions between industry visions and everyday imaginaries. This is the case about EV futures. And reconsideration also of the dominant vision of the relationship between everyday priorities relating to house size and energy demand. So what did Catherine was to ask people about how did it downsize and what it meant in two very different contexts. One is Australia, where the housing is one of the largest in the world, and then the UK, which is one of the smallest in Europe. And there was also a consideration of ownership as a central pillar of energy democracy that has been investigated by Elizabeth Rush and Michael Koene, and who shows how this question of the ability to use energy the way you want, but also not to use it in their cases, as they are speaking about people with very little means, is completely central. And this is also something that we found out throughout the examples. And then there's the case of co-working space and how those spaces and the people who use them trying to, in some cases, live a better life, a life more closer from the nature, is completely also designed by the network of electricity, but also transportation. And this aspiration to live wherever you want is really taken back by this contingency that you need to live where there is also a way to go around and where to connect. So I'm going to leave it to you, Simon, again. If I can change, okay.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Natalie. So in this section of the book, we're looking at some of the ways in which the kind of grand industry visions of the future and grand political visions of the future can get derailed in different ways. And that's largely to do with the kind of the gap, if you like, between the framing of a future vision and what happens when it hits the ground. And let me start with my own case study, just to show really how that works. So I was doing a study of, with my colleague Antti Silvast, of modelers working on integrated energy systems and looking at the way in which they reconcile the challenge of working with partial data, if you like. I mean, they know very well that their models are not one-to-one models, right? They're a representation of the world. And in being a representation, they have limitations. And so as soon as you try to relate them to the wider world, you're living with those limitations. And it's very interesting for us to see the real distance between the world in which models are designed and the way in which they're used later on, the way in which all of the kind of careful definitions of the limitations of a model as they're being developed sort of fall away once they enter into the political process and become used as evidence for a certain kind of investment, for example, or a certain kind of change. And that theme, I guess, flows through the other examples. So the central image here is of a female engineer trained by the Barefoot College in India to install solar kits in an area that does not have access to electrical grids. And the interesting thing for us to hear was to see how a kind of what Chiara calls a sort of solar utopia slightly comes undone when in the translation between a successful process of empowering women in India is transferred to a small community in southern Mexico, where the very, I guess what we would consider very progressive notion of particularly educating women to have a technological role comes up against a very different kind of political structure in the local community, very different expectations around gender, and into a kind of patronage society where certain things are okay and certain things disrupt the patronage or the power of local notables. Leaving the women actually quite vulnerable when it came down to it. In the image on the left, you'll see what you can see actually is a huge demonstration in the eastern part of Germany, and oddly enough, it's a slightly complicated protest. What's happening in the eastern part of Germany is that coal mining is being wound down in the interests of a green revolution. But at the same time, open cast coal mines are still expanding. And in this situation, in this particular context, a village on the edge of a mine in the Lausitz part of eastern Germany is under threat. And what happens is that, is under threat because the mine wants to expand under the village, so it wants to move the village. And there's been a very long-running legal case and a long campaign against this, and it's kind of brought together people with very different approaches to coal and to clean energy futures. So even people who want the transition to go ahead and people who don't want the transition to go ahead come together around this to protect this village and the people who live there, and the question of how they're going to make a living if the coal mining ends, and also how they're going to live if the coal mining continues. The final example, which doesn't have an image in this particular slide, is about contested visions of wind energy futures in Taiwan, where the government wanted to open up a kind of liberal area with low planning regulation to bring in wood investment into the area, and shows us how people who actually were really positive about renewable energy, their lives were completely disrupted because of the way that the land was allocated and the way that permissions and concessions were given to allow wind turbines to be built in areas that are very sensitive for a certain kind of fishing. So it kind of illustrates the fact that, your grand narrative about, we have to go to renewable energy, we have to do it quickly, we have to enable, big investments in new developments. If they're not done with some sensitivity to the context in which that is happening, then they always grind into these kind of ongoing political problems. And I guess what we're showing in this is that even with the best will in the world, some of these well-intentioned projects are generating resistance that may not have been there in the first place. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Karen, I believe.
And before you do, we did want to, intersperse with some quickie clarifying questions if anybody has one. I saw one from Jordan, which we're going to save until after we've talked about decolonization. But does anybody, please put it in chat, have any questions as of right now in terms of clarifying anything that Simone and Natalie have discussed? And give me just a second here. Great. If not, seeing nothing right now, Karen, if you'll go ahead, that would be wonderful.
Yes, thank you. So I will be talking a bit about the final chapter in the book. And I did see in the chat that somebody posed a question relating to, well, how are then the indigenous groups in question part of these imagined futures? What role do they play? And I only have this slide, but I actually just, when I saw the question, pulled up a few more slides from the chapter. So maybe I can share my screen. But just to say before that the three authors that I wrote this chapter with, let's see. We're here. Are you seeing my slides now?
Yes, we see them.
Yes. So the book, now you can see it in double because we're so happy we have the hard copy finally. So this is a picture of one of the Sami indigenous activists that Ragnhild Frank Dahle, who's one of the anthropologists who co-authored this chapter, collaborates with. The case she looks at is how in northern Norway that the green transition really pushes other very important questions to the side. And one of them is how it affects the livelihoods of Sami reindeer herders in northern Norway. And you should go ahead and check out the book to read her empirical chapter. But I thought I would say a bit about it due to the question in the chat, because what we try to conceptualize in this chapter is the notion of enunciatory collaborations, that the way we work together as non-indigenous anthropologists with the groups in the areas where we worked is that of finding overlapping stakes. And then we draw on theory from, this is both Kim Fortune, who has worked with the term enunciatory collaborations, but also Stuart Hall, who's very central in the framing that we give for the chapter that we co-write. So as in the other chapters, we are 4 authors. We each share our empirical material. And then we, over the years, since we started this first meeting that Simone showed you a picture of, we've discussed, well, how can we kind of shed light on each other's empirical material concerning these same thematics and find some concepts that help us unlock some of this. And enunciatory collaborations was one of these terms, namely because we all grapple with how it is that we work with communities, and not to fall in any trap around romanticizing working with indigenous groups, because most people that do so will know that, as in any other groups, there are lots of friction and different positions in that landscape. But overall, the foundational idea was to say that everywhere that we work, which is for Ragnhild Frank Dahle, northern Norway, for Martin Funk, the Chilean Andes, and for Pierre Duplessis, it's the Kalahari. And for me, it's South Africa. that in each of these places there are alternatives to approaching the landscape that we inhabit, the environment that we inhabit, in more relational terms, in various ways, and connecting to that also, and learning from that as part of what both Simone and Nathalie have pointed to as kind of trying to disrupt these dominant narratives. So that has been the framing for our chapter, and we can discuss it more. Let me just quickly share. This is from a JBC truck. It's Pierre Duplessis fieldwork with trackers, Karangabarari and San and Baklagadi communities in the Kalahari. And this is really them tracing and tracking, but not animals as they have previously, but all of the people coming, prospecting in the area, and using a lot of water, which is a very scarce resource. And then Pierre has, with them, traced the effects on their landscape when the trucks leave, because it's not stable enough to actually get anything out of it. So that is the case he looks at. And then the other image is from the El Tacho geyser field in Chile, in the Chilean Andes. And it's a picture from 1929 by Jean Brugger, and Martin Funk looks at how geothermal energy and these kind of imaginaries and fantasies about how much resource there was in this water underneath the Earth's surface really had a lot of people arriving in this area over the years, especially a lot of Italian engineers. And he shows how the ideas of the area where they had worked in Italy was kind of transposed to this area, and without interacting much with the local population or understanding how this landscape was different to what they expected. And then finally, my case, where I'll delve a little bit more into it. This is an area outside of Cape Town in South Africa, where the group I have worked with are so-called coloreds. That's how they were categorized during the apartheid years, and how they still mainly understand themselves in the area where I work. And that group was also thrown together with the Khoikhoi and San hunter-gatherer communities. And now there's, I work in this area, a township of some 80,000 people, and look at how, well, in February this year, Cyril Ramaphosa, the South African president, declared a national state of disaster because the load shedding, the rolling blackouts are now up to 8 hours a day. And as you can imagine, that has devastating consequences. So in this chapter, I actually, and thank you, Nathalie, for alerting me to that when we were writing the book, I have a lot of things in common with two authors that wrote, co-authored Nathalie's section of the book, who also work in South Africa in the African Center for Cities, looking at data centers. Because interestingly, I look at the everyday lives in this area of people, where people really want to be connected as much as the next person. But there's not a lot of funds, resources, money to pay for data on your phone. It's 10 times the price of data in Britain. And up until recently, it was 10 times slower, just to put it into very concrete terms. And then in addition, there are now just blackouts, and people do not have a generator in this area. There are no street lights, crime goes up. It's horrible to go through load shedding day after day in a situation like this, a living situation like this. And at the same time, as you can read in the book's chapter 4, South Africa's data center industry is really booming, and Cape Town is the city on the African continent with the most very energy hungry data centers. So there are some interesting frictions there. And this is some of the young people I worked with in the area. Here, a family father and his son shows these air fibers, they call them, because it's a red zone due to gang violence. There's no really grid or infrastructure. So it's privately owned air fiber poles that they put up to be able to be connected. Then connecting to, in my case, what does the indigenous communities have to say in terms of these imaginaries? Well, very concretely, they try to push back on the most recent development is that Amazon are building a very large headquarter, African headquarter in observatory just outside of Cape Town, which is fragile floodplain. And it's also, a fragile, adding to that, it's also sacred land for some of these groups. And these images are from October, November last year, which was after I wrote the chapter, but I returned and followed up. And on the one, it's Tariq Jenkins, who's also at the Khoisan unit at the University of Cape Town and also an activist. And he's standing in front of the area where they're developing and building the Amazon River Club complex. And on the other image, it's in front of the parliament in Cape Town and another grouping. So there's a lot of friction between these groupings and a lot of truth claims and claims about indigeneity and rights to land and to energy going on that I won't go into here. But I think if I still have 2 minutes or so, I wanted to return to something that I think was really interesting when we were writing the blurb together back and forth, and that I really wanted to share with everyone here this afternoon, which is that anthropology, as I see it, or social science, humanities, broadly speaking, in these questions are pivotal. And it's not only or even mainly because of our methods, our ethnographic methods. It's because of the way that we frame things. And in our chapter, we have drawn on Martin Heidegger, actually, to say that in contrast to how he has said that modern Europe, US is at a point in time where through automation and industrialization and so on, that technology has almost taken over. So in the beginning, it was the lands, the resources, it was animals, everything was standing reserves for us and our technology. And now we got to a point, he said back in the day, where it's actually us ourselves, we've become standing reserves. And it's because it's this Gestel, it's this inframing, as he calls it, that the way we think about technology and technological progress and technological development and so on has its own logic. And so we drew that out in our chapter to say there are many other logics. And together with people, with these overlapping stakes, we can contribute some of these very, very urgently needed alternatives to, that's the last point, going back to where Simone started, these imaginaries that we talk about, that we have tropes, we have narratives dominant from industry, and it's almost scripts for how we can even think about how to act, how to intervene or not. And these cultural scripts, they become prescriptive. So they tell us how we can even act consciously or unconsciously. And that is why we need to reconceptualize that. And we do that with everyone we work with, indigenous or not. And that reconceptualization, and then definitely sitting at the table and working with designers, engineers, modelers, policymakers, etc. That is, I think, what we want to say with the book that anthropology can offer in in imagining energy futures differently.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen. I'm not seeing questions yet, but we're going to have a few minutes here. I'm going to pose a question to the panelists and get us started here. Any one of you four can answer this, but I guess my question to you is, the BECC was founded specifically to communicate social science insights to policymakers and energy producers and distributors. So utilities specifically, not Shell, but PG&E, your big state-run organizations. What would you like somebody from that world to take away from your book?
Can I jump in? I think the main message we want to bring to people like that is that other futures are possible. And to maybe help them recognize some of the things that they take for granted, they could actually rethink. So, and I have to say that in recent years, I'm finding that the people in those organizations are much more receptive to these ideas and to these arguments, and to the challenge of, thinking differently about the future, because everybody knows that the futures we've been living with are not working, and we have to find new ways of doing things. And I think each of the case studies in this book, and there's quite a good collection of them, they bring a different aspect that will help people to kind of maybe question how they see the world, and maybe how they could work slightly differently, and maybe how they could make a space to hear different people in a different way.
Thanks, Simone. Does anybody else have anything to answer that question?
Yes. Yeah. Just following what Simone was saying and what I'm observing here in France from a governmental institution, there is this realization that there is no silver bullet solution. And so this needs to open up the discussion to everybody. So it needs also for government institutions, technicians, engineers to look at the way they live around them differently than they used to. And there is no script to follow that will be the same in everywhere and will be the solution everywhere. So this is also what the book brings from my point of view.
Karen, you had something to say?
Yes, I just wanted to add that concretely, that's the overall aims. And as Natalie says, there's no one size fits all, but inviting more perspectives to the table can give us some solutions that we weren't able to conceive before. And what came out of this book in that regard was actually that after Natalie had alerted Lisa Sirolia and me to the fact that we had overlapping interest, but coming from very different sides and backgrounds, we started drafting a project together where the aim is exactly, as you said, getting these insights to not just policymakers, but the city of Cape Town, where in South Africa, the city has, they're the ones actually distributing and making sure that Eskom, the national utility, that the electricity gets to their citizens, inhabitants in the city and so on. So we really wanted to say, rather than sometimes it becomes like, well, we want to push back or speak back and so on. And rather than say, it's a very, very problematic situation where I work in this township outside of Cape Town, then say we want to do a project where there's equal weight on looking at the statecraft on the city level. Like, how are they, even though very fractured and in a situation of scarcity, how is the city as an actor still actually delivering quite a lot of services to a very large amount of people? and how can we work with them from both sides, and have future workshops and bring them together in ways where we can aid towards finding a solution that works in that context. It might not in any other, but it could inspire how to work in other contexts.
Great,
so that was
thanks. We have a question from the audience. And maybe, Karen, this might be for you, but any of you three can answer it. Monica is asking, could you expand on the aspect of digitalization in the energy future? What does it mean, and how does that relate to anthropology?
So I guess the question is more for me. What does it mean? One of the things that we wanted to investigate is how those futures are built. And one of the futures that is built right now is around smart futures. So we wanted to investigate first what those infrastructure were doing to the world we were living in, and it's what Karen was explaining in the case of Cape Town. But that's also something we were observing in Paris, for example, where those infrastructure are hampering the energy around them and are creating energy shortage in places where they are not supposed to be. And they are also a new kind of, they are creating new kind of inequalities and around them, which is also something that we found it very interesting to investigate, and important, not just interesting, but investigate. What also does digitalization is doing is that it's often proposed as the solution for the problems that we have. This is supposed to solution our problems of traveling, and we are one example tonight. But also of the places where we want to work, of the place of how we can buy things extra. But what is often forgotten is also that those places are consuming a huge amount of energy, and they are not placed randomly on the territories. And they are also reshaping, as is shown in the case, for example, of Iceland, their entire politics. So this is why digitalization is also important for anthropology and matters.
That's a great question and a great answer. Thank you, Natalie. Does anybody else want to talk about digitalization? If not, I have a question for the panel. If you were ready. So one of my questions would be, as we're getting a little bit close to the end, is, was there something from your field site or case study that surprised you? And if so, can you tell us about it? There always is.
I have a very quick one. There always is. I've been working in this area since my my MA studies in 2005, and I continue to be surprised. And this time around in October, November last year, I was looking at, referring back to the last question, digital everyday lives in this township. And it just was so striking how one mobile phone, we're so used to thinking about, you know, data, personal data being captured and used in algorithmic systems and surveillance and what have we, in at least in Scandinavia. And talking to people there, and I have 5 local research assistants, and we all experience the same thing, which is that talking to people about how they use the phone, that makes sense. They often don't have one phone. So trying to figure out for any company, you know, the digital traces of preferences or how they communicate or which platforms they use would create a very interesting picture, because it's everyone from a 3-year-old to the father, to the mother, to the grandmother. There's not one person, one phone, one identity on different social media. at all. It's a very complex issue. But what was interesting was that posing the question, are you at all concerned about your personal data? It's not that people said that they didn't care, it's that the question did not make sense to people. It's just, what do you mean? I paid for my data. It's pay as you go. Some people have data packages, but most often, you pay for data in bundles. So it just didn't make sense to them. What do you mean? That they can take my data? I have the data on my phone that I paid for. The idea that you should be worried about somebody, following your digital footsteps is just of absolutely no concern to them. And it also didn't really make sense to them why I would think that this was something we should talk about. And I do think it's something we should talk about, because there's a reason why Meta is building the 2 Africa continent-wide fiber optic cable networks and have people sign up for free. So but there are different hierarchies of concern. But that was one of the things that that surprised me this time around.
I do want to hear from the other two, but I will just say briefly, in my own fieldwork last summer in Atlanta, we discovered people don't understand how fans work, like fans, and that fans use less energy than air conditioning, like just not on the radar. So Natalie, you had your hand up.
No, I was just going to follow up with Karen. The part on digitalization was really the more interesting in many ways, and the more surprising, because as Karen says, for South Africa, we have the same in Europe. Most people do absolutely not recognize this part of their life, and very often they do not connect it to any kind of infrastructure. So fiber, yes, a little bit, but to digital centers and what they are doing, it's absolutely a huge invisible, as we were saying, glaring spot in all those. All the discussions that we have around for the people, but also for most of the politics, I would say, is still invisible also there. So this is why also I think the book is important, if I may say.
And I guess in my case, when I first started working on energy systems integration, the first thing that surprised me was how incredibly well read the energy demand modelers were in the sociology of energy and the sociology of consumption. That was really, really interesting. And I think also we shared a lot of concern around the limitations of what modeling could do. And then beyond that group, I think that the sheer variety and incompatibility of different kinds of modeling approaches used in systemization was kind of mind-blowing, really, and the enormity of the challenge. So, you hear these sorts of stories being repeated all the time around, oh, we can integrate energy systems and make them more effective, and we'll create a digital twin and we'll model this and we'll model that. But actually, the nitty-gritty of it is almost impossible, and in fact, incredibly challenging. And I think a lot of the things that are routinely sort of trotted out about energy futures, most of the people really centrally involved are quite skeptical and very concerned about the kind of flaws and the potential repercussions of some of the things that are happening. So that very kind of, in some cases, quite politicized and quite kind of socially concerned. And they're very, certainly the group of people that I've been working with, or the groups of people I've been working with in recent years, extremely open to ideas from anthropology and social sciences and STS, and really want to learn more about it. And that's been a really positive experience. I think that we're not pushing a closed door, we're pushing an open door, and there's a real thirst for the kind of knowledge that we're offering.
Thank you. Do we have any last questions from the audience? While we're waiting, we have five minutes. I'm going to pose one. And we'll cut it short if somebody types something really quickly. I guess my last question would be, Karen, you mentioned Heidegger. I was wondering, you guys have talked about writing this together, not as an edited volume. I thought that was really interesting. Would you say that you share a theoretical orientation? And if so, can you tell us about that?
Maybe I can just frame that, because I think we've been really inspired by, especially I think the Energy Futures Network, which started, which I think we were all involved when it started. It started with a manifesto. And the manifesto said that we are not going to be afraid to get our hands dirty and to do things and make change. And if there's anything that unites us, I think it's that approach that we don't want to just step back, describe the world and say, hey, that's how it is. We actually want to get involved. We want to allow and empower people to think about their own futures and engage in those dialogues and get involved in designing and rethinking those futures. So, I mean, the others can agree or disagree, but I'm pretty sure that's the thing that brings us together here.
Anybody else want to pitch in or feel like that pretty much covered it? Well, we are at 3:27 and I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. So I would bring it back to our hosts, Nick and Miriam, for any last words. You're muted, Miriam. You're muted.
Sorry, thank you so much. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to give a really quick sort of closing question. If we're thinking about the future generation, and it seems like so much of your work hinges on the ability to bring different people together and have these conversations, what's one short piece of advice you have for somebody who might be interested in getting into this type of research or, you know, embarking on a project like this for how to best communicate between people with diverse opinions?
That's a challenging question. I guess the answer is always to start by listening, I think, and hearing what people are really saying to you in order to find out how you can. Karen, have you got?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And then I also wanted to add, speaking about this book, that some of the comic strips that Natalie showed, that Sarah Pink, our colleague in Australia, did with her team, Kari Dahlgren and the others, and not be afraid to kind of venture outside of the, you know, the academic article when we communicate, not just as dissemination formats, but also in the process. So when we're talking across, you know, engineers and people just, you know, going about their everyday life and our anthropological conceptualization of things, that to me, it's been really helpful to work with photo or film or photo diaries with people, or draw on some of these more multimodal methods, maybe just sketching to discuss what are we actually talking about. Maybe there's something with Simone and working with modelers also, that we all have our different models, but it can help as, you know, as these scaffolds if we share them, if we make explicit what is in our head and not only in words and writing. So that's a concrete advice.
Yeah, what I was going to add is, yes, you need to translate. Don't hesitate to ask questions, and just be sure that the vocabulary they are using is really what you mean also, and that you have something in common. So this needs patience.
What a wonderful note to end on. And thank you all so much. This was fantastic. And we look forward to next month's webinar, which will be announced shortly. Thank you all so much for joining.